Welcome to Still Loading. This is the podcast where people who work in marketing and e-commerce will tell the truth about what it actually takes, the stuff that doesn't make it onto the case study, the LinkedIn post, or the highlight reel. Today's guest has a career that started somewhere most people wouldn't expect. She ran her own fashion, travel, and lifestyle blog while still at university. That blog became a personal brand, a business, and eventually the foundation of a 12-year career leading brand, content, and communication strategies across some of the most interesting high-growth SaaS and e-commerce businesses in the UK. She's been head of content at THG Ingenuity, senior director of global brand and content at Amplience, and she's now the founder of True Meridian, a strategic advisory helping technology companies turn complexity into clarity. She's also a keynote speaker and panel moderator, which means she spends a lot of her time listening to other people's story, which makes her an interesting person to ask about her own. Beth Norton, welcome to Still Loading.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
It's been quite a while, roughly about 4 years.
It has been a while.
Yeah, and you've moved on to quite a lot of things since we worked together at THG. But as always, we start the same way. Beth, what was your first click?
My first click probably happened, Abdi, when I was about 18. And that click was the power of storytelling for engaging an audience, for sales, and also conversion. As he briefly mentioned in the introduction, I obviously had a blog that then I turned into a career, and this was completely unexpected. I did not expect to commercialize this in any way. I started writing on my own website. I kind of taught myself SEO, taught myself content, taught myself social media. And I was essentially telling my audience about what I was wearing, where I was traveling, kind of life stories. And there were a number of brands that recognized the power of that kind of loyal community. I had a very, very loyal readership. And a lot of people were subscribed to the website and the articles that I was writing. And they realized the power of conversion within that. So people wanted to buy from me because what I was writing was authentic. It was about my life. And they also trusted what I was telling them. And I think that was my first click, was understanding the power of storytelling in sales and conversion.
It's quite interesting that you started with your own personal blog, because most marketers will have started their journey as consumers of it as opposed to creators, whereas you've kind of started the other way around. But things seemed like they were going quite well for you with your content creation. What drove you to going full time?
So it's a great question. I was essentially earning enough money. I was earning a full-time salary from my blog, which led me to pursue it full time. I've got to be honest, I was a little bit skeptical. I'd kind of seen things about, things like Instagram going down, or there being glitches on the website, or I was a little bit cautious of relying solely on that as one income. But I knew that it would open so many doors and opportunities. And I think there are a lot of skills that I adopted and developed myself, having, have had a business so young. I think I registered the business at 18, which is crazy. So I then had to teach myself things like, SEO and brand relationships and brand partnerships, had to teach myself PR. There were all of these different strands to what I was doing that I think set me up in really good stead later in my career, because I didn't finish university. I actually dropped out of university to pursue this full time. And there were a number of years after I did that where I thought, gosh, somebody one day is going to tap me on the shoulder and say, you don't deserve to be here. You're not qualified, you don't have a degree. And actually, I think going into the working world and owning that business so young was so beneficial later in life for all of the different roles that I've then had, because there were so many skills that I taught myself and just wanted to further develop working for different brands and different companies. I made the decision financially, and I also knew that from a skill set perspective, it would broaden my horizons later in life.
That's quite a fascinating journey, because you've mentioned bringing content with SEO and digital PR. That's something that 12 years ago, brands didn't really link together. But until now, not many brands actually combine those three properly.
Yeah, I know.
So that was a realization really early on for you. How did that serve as a USP in your career?
I think that's a really interesting question. I think because I understood the channel mix and the power of those channels working in tandem. So, I'm probably okay to say this, but I think at THG, we probably both knew a lot of channels worked in silo, and that's the same in most businesses. So at THG, we were responsible for essentially pitching our own channels as heads of department, right? Rather than a client or a customer buying a channel mix and kind of the full marketing funnel, they would pick and choose, and then we had to pitch, which is a very bizarre way of working because channels don't work together in silo. That's why under a GTM umbrella or a marketing umbrella, you have multiple channels, kind of working together. And I think even now there are a lot of businesses working in those silos that aren't leveraging the power of that kind of cross-functional collaboration to kind of work towards a pipeline goal, for example, or conversion targets or revenue targets. And early on, I saw that traction. I saw what that was doing for my business. I saw what it was doing for brand partnerships. And I was also lucky enough to be able to see the commercial aspect from the brand side. So through affiliates, for example, or I would get sales reports. So I knew the results of what I was producing for them. And I got to see that in terms of, the numbers in terms of revenue and commercial impact, which was really powerful from a young age. And I think kind of seeing that all work together, Abdu, was then something I took forward into future businesses in understanding how best to work with different teams across departments.
I love that you said that. So I also started my career in SEO. I was working at a small agency in Leeds called Search Laboratory. It was more of a multilingual marketing agency. I started in the SEO team. This was sort of around 2010, roughly, where black hat SEO was a big thing. And the majority of my time was spent disavowing dodgy links and, re-looking at link structure and what have you. But literally 2 desks down from where I'm sat, we had the digital PR team that did 2 things. 4 or 5 of them would always sit in a room and brainstorm really clever ideas to drive, viral content. At the time, Twitter was a big social media platform. Facebook was quite big. Instagram was still sort of in its very, very early days. And there were a few campaigns that went viral. One actually made it on TV in the US, where it was around Halloween, and we were working with a brand called Tiger Sheds, and the idea was a zombie-proof cabin listed for about 70 grand or something ridiculous like that. And it went viral. I think they got hundreds of links off the back of that. It was like 3 years worth of link targets in 1 week. But that required an entire team to come up with the idea, put the content together, do the outreach, journal request at the time on Twitter and what have you. How were you able to do all of that as a solo team, doing that on your own?
I watched a lot of YouTube tutorials, interestingly enough. I think especially when it came to building the website, understanding, it was minimal code, but there was some code involved. And I was understanding SEO, so I was really tracking my analytics on Google Analytics. I was looking at visibility, I was looking at impressions, and I basically taught myself the SEO fundamentals through a couple of online courses to try and understand how I could get eyes on my website, which, for me meant more brand partnerships. It meant kind of more money. It also meant a bigger audience, which was really important at the time. So how I managed it, Abdu, I didn't sleep very much in those years at all. And I was pretty much, unless I was shooting a campaign at an event or on a brand PR trip somewhere in the world, I was absolutely glued to my laptop. And I think that's what is different now because, you've got kind of, I say bloggers loosely, people don't really blog anymore, but, influencers on YouTube or on Instagram, and they spend a lot of time editing for sure, but there wasn't that sort of manual task of SEO and, kind of website management and upkeep. It was a lot of admin. And I was absolutely determined to kind of keep it all in house and do it all myself because it meant that I was learning kind of as I was doing it. And that was really important to me because I was developing skills at the same time. So with great difficulty and very little sleep is how I managed that as a single person.
Now, the other angle I'd love to double click into is working on your own and working for yourself, building your own brand and content sort of business at the time before going into full-time employment. What did building something for yourself first give you that people who went straight into employment didn't have?
A lot of experience. I've been fortunate enough, Abdu, in the last few years to mentor a couple of individuals, and I've really, really loved it. And I think one thing I always say to them is not necessarily about the qualifications. It's about the life experience, the work experience, your applicable skills to a role, even if it's an industry you've never worked in before. And I think having that experience early on, some people will intern while they're at university or while they're at college, all of that experience compounds and is incredibly valuable when a business is looking to hire, because you can look fantastic on paper, but if you've never actually worked in an organization before, or you have no hands-on experience doing those things, you're probably not going to be successful. And what really sets people apart is having that kind of lived experience from a really young age. So I try and always encourage people when I'm, supporting them with kind of career development, is try and get work experience in the sector that you want to work in. Offer to help somebody do like a project for free, or work with a different creative. Just try and understand the levers of how these things work, so that then when you interview, you're better placed to tell a story about the experience you've already had.
That's really interesting. And you then went into the Hut Group before going into other businesses. But if we double click into THG for a moment, everyone is aware that THG is quite a fast growing business, very fast paced business. You touched on the reality from a marketing mix point of view, but how did you deal with that challenge of marketing mix, and what did it teach you that you couldn't have learned anywhere else?
And that's a great question. I mean, one, we worked there. Well, I certainly started during lockdown. So e-commerce was absolutely exploding. I was doing like 14-hour days stuck to my desk when everyone else was outside enjoying the sun. But I think what it really taught me was, I spent a lot of time with the different department heads. And I think, as I mentioned before, it did seem like people were working in silo. But the more that the department heads talked and realized there was an opportunity for kind of collaboration and how we could achieve a client's goals together, it really helped me to understand how everything works in tandem. It wasn't just about selling, content from my team and my services into a client. It was, actually, we need social media to support this content amplification. We need SEO because we need to make sure we're getting visibility and we're expanding our audience. We even need affiliates because that goes hand in hand with some of the campaigns that are being produced. And it just started to become, rather than, kind of one small opportunity to achieve one goal, actually it was holistically, we can achieve something pretty incredible for these clients, and we've got the case studies to prove it. So then we would go to the table and we kind of pitch together, which was amazing.
We've had plenty of co-pitches. One was a Formula E brand, and the content strategy basically revolutionized their performance. So definitely agree there. You then went to Amplience, which is a B2B SaaS business. Now that's very different environment from an environment point of view to an e-commerce business. The audience would have changed dramatically for you.
Massively.
What did you have to rewire in how you thought about brand and content?
When I moved to Amplience, it became less about what content do we need to produce and more about what business problem are we trying to solve. So there was a real shift from content production to strategy. And I think the thing is with B2B, particularly in the SaaS space and the e-commerce space, you need to speak to the audience and understand their pain points. So you're not just producing content because it looks good on the website or you're trying to sell a product. You're actually trying to gain the trust of the decision makers and the buyers, because the sales cycles in B2B tech can be like 6 months to a year or even 2 years. It's not like a consumer product where they click on a D2C site and they'll make a purchase within 5 minutes. So you need to build up that trust over time. And the way you did that is obviously understanding their pain points, speaking to how you could solve some of their daily challenges, and also understanding each of the core buyer personas. So what is it that they're doing on a day-to-day basis, and how does the product or the platform fit into that and their roles and responsibilities? So there was a real deep dive, and I worked very, very closely with product marketing at the time. And actually, I'm doing with my recent promotion there, before I left, I was in the product marketing team, which from a content perspective made sense because I was so in the weeds with the branding and the messaging and how we're actually positioning the product to our core personas. It made more sense for me to sit within product marketing than kind of GTM and marketing. But I think the biggest shift was the deep dive on the customer. Who is the customer? What is the problem that we're trying to solve for them, and why would they trust us to do it?
Yeah, and when you speak about the customer persona from a B2B point of view, there's probably two layers to that, because you're looking at what are the problem statements for the business, but then behind the business's problem statements, there's the buyer themselves, and what sort of resistance could they have? And how do you get their buy-in? And there's almost two barriers to entry, because you're not just communicating a solution and a value add to the business. It's how I, as a buyer, Abdu, might feel skeptical about a specific product or service. And how do you break that barrier? How do you identify that barrier? What did you do to uncover that?
So I think we produced a lot of content around not just the problems that we were trying to solve, but actually the day-to-day operations as a whole. So we're tying kind of problem solution content with thought leadership content. And it's that thought leadership content that I actually think hooks interest, because you're talking more broadly about how their industry is changing, how their operations might be changing. AI was a big one, because when we first, I guess, evolved into an AI platform when I was at Amplience, a lot of people were hesitant. There was, my LinkedIn newsfeed was full of people saying AI is going to take your job. And actually it was teaching people that it's not. AI is an enabler and it augments, but it doesn't replace. And we really had to speak to the buyers in that language to help them understand that their job was not at risk. And actually what this technology could do was help them to work more efficiently, produce more content. It could, help them with ideation, for example. It was almost changing their perspective and eliminating their fears through content production.
And it rings true, and we'll double click into that later on. But for now, you use the term turning complexity into clarity. And that's this is how you describe what True Meridian does. And it's a great tagline, very catchy. But what does it actually look like when you're sitting in front of a founder or a leadership team for the first time?
So turning complexity into clarity, one thing I've seen kind of within the roles that I've held and also in the businesses that I'm working with now. And as businesses grow and they scale, that's where the complexity starts to happen. You've got marketing running kind of one tagline and one messaging hierarchy. You've got product marketing saying something different. You've got the founder who thinks the product is something else and the website saying something completely different. And you've got this ambiguity between teams and it feels really disjointed. And I think what people don't realize is businesses don't outgrow their product. They outgrow the story that they're telling about their product, and they need to move at the same pace as they're scaling. And I think a lot of businesses struggle with that. So my role is to help them take that complexity, understand where the challenges are, understand where the different messaging strands are coming from, and turn it into kind of a cohesive, overarching narrative that the business then speaks to their audience about. So how are we speaking to each of the personas? What does the messaging hierarchy look for different channels? Are we all aligned internally in terms of cross-functionally? Are the teams all speaking and using the same language? And essentially, I help them go to market with that clear, coherent messaging.
It's interesting you say that, because a lot of businesses have that sort of scattergun approach. Every team does their own thing. They feel like they're organized and that they are aligned from a North Star point of view, but the actions probably would prove otherwise. And then what a lot of businesses fall into the trap of doing is thinking, right, maybe if we brought an AI tool that's going to help us become a lot more efficient. But the reality is it's just going to amplify what's already in there. So if you as an organization are working in lots of different silos, AI isn't going to organize you, and it's just going to amplify the silos and the inconsistencies, and it won't work. It'll probably be a car crash 9 out of 10 times. How do you then get the buy-in from all of those stakeholders and the founders to try and just bring a bit of order? Because there's potentially a lot of opinions you're trying to bring together, potentially a lot of egos. You might have people who have been in the business for 5, 6, 10 years who'll sit there going, I've been here for 10 years. We've done this way all that time. Why should I change it for you?
It's a great question. So one thing I've been doing recently, one of the services that I offer is essentially executive workshops. So I bring kind of the key stakeholders in the process together. That could be someone from product marketing, could be engineering, it could be one of the CEOs or the founders. And I will put them all in a room and understand their perspective in terms of how they're speaking to their audience. So what is our product called? What does the product do? And who are we trying to sell to? And you get a lot of different answers. It's really interesting. Everybody's working for the same business, but everybody's got a different idea about what the product is and what it does. But within that workshop, what we'll try and do is make the messaging cohesive. So we're getting input from all the different stakeholders, but we're also using data. It could be search data. It could be data from a PR campaign. It could be an opportunity gap analysis that I've run amongst competitors. We're using data to inform the language that we should be using. And we essentially try and come to a middle ground. Now, not everybody in the room is going to be happy, but what they will leave with after that session is an understanding of how that messaging is going to land in the market and therefore how they're going to meet their kind of commercial targets. So that's what I tend to do to make sure that everybody feels involved. But fundamentally, Abdu, it does come down to having the right data to be able to prove how the messaging evolution can then support kind of business targets.
And probably a bit of a segue, but leadership comes into this quite strongly, and that relies on who's running that business. And a lot of the times you'll see in different businesses where people have conflicting opinions, the leaders will opt to say, why don't you guys go and figure it out, talk to one another and figure it out. And that's probably the worst way of doing it. Whereas the reality is, the right thing to do is facilitate a way and orchestrate a way for people to bring views together and actually start working. And the reality is you don't have to be best mates as long as you can work well together.
Exactly.
And you can be a formidable force as a collective. And then asking the question around, what do you need in order to be more aligned with so and so, and what do you then need to be aligned with this other person? And I think that's a bit of an internal challenge that brands have to navigate.
It is. I've worked with a couple of businesses who they encourage healthy conflict, they call it, which I think it is very healthy. The difficulty comes, Abdu, is when businesses haven't actually got the key stakeholders together in one room. So there'll be kind of the leadership or the executive team doing a workshop about how they think the business should be positioned. You've got product marketing doing something different, and product themselves hosting their own workshops. And actually, I think it's been surprising walking into businesses that are, I would say, fairly mature, kind of mature in terms of AI and where they're at in terms of their evolution. And they haven't yet sat everyone together in one room. And that's something that's key, right, for making the business decisions going forward. So that's something that really does change the game when you've got kind of cross-functional alignment.
And I suppose, what's the most difficult part of what you do that clients don't necessarily see?
The most difficult part of what I do, it's probably getting buy-in from multiple stakeholders because there might be somebody who recognizes the value instantly and brings me in quite quickly. You'll get some people that are a little bit hesitant to that change, or hesitant to an external consultant or advisor, for example, because they think I might not know the business. That's been quite challenging. And also probably as well, the data analysis that underpins all of the decisions that I will then make before kind of I work with that client. So the opportunity and gap analysis, I'm doing kind of SEO, GEO search analysis, I'm doing PR analysis, and I'm also speaking to their core audience and some of their buyer personas to get direct feedback about how they're receiving the product. And that is quite time consuming, but it's obviously necessary to make sure that, I can help them with success.
So you're doing the qualitative and quantitative research up front as well. And how often does this sort of unseen value add come up when it comes to discussing commercials? Because a lot of the time, getting that alignment within the leadership can be time consuming. That time is worth something, but it might not necessarily be a tangible outcome to that leadership team. What they'll see is the content, the conversions, the leads generated, but they might not necessarily see that this alignment, and that could have taken weeks and months of hard work. But then how much is that alignment really worth to the business? And how often have you had to have that conversation with a client?
Multiple times. But from a commercial perspective, I essentially kind of package as deliverables. So it's not an hourly rate, it's not a day rate. I've got a couple of clients where I do day rates, but mostly Abdu, it's a package of deliverables in terms of meeting a target or to a project timeline. And part of those deliverables is doing the groundwork from a data analysis perspective. So I can ensure that that's covered. But I've absolutely had to have a difficult conversation that says, look, there's 2 weeks worth of work gone into this before I've even sat in front of you today. So you do have to help them understand, and I have to walk them through the results and present those in a way that, makes them understand that why I've done it and how it's going to help them.
And why tech companies and SaaS?
I really enjoy the industry. I think ever since I started at Amplience, I was bowled over by the capabilities of our product. I was bowled over by the global retailers that use it. We had some incredible customers. And I really saw in day-to-day operations, I spoke to our customers, I built case studies, I was at events with them, I traveled with them, and I really understood the difference that it was making in their workflows. It could be time to market, it could be revenue. It was just quite astounding. And I really became invested in the capabilities and also in the wider industry. I got to know our partners and how they kind of fit into the ecosystem, how they fit into our kind of buying cycle. And I just really enjoyed it, Abdu. It's something I feel quite passionate about. It definitely seems like a sidestep given kind of where I started my career, but I think I found my industry.
The perfect story follows a cyclical format, so it kind of ends where it began. And you've started with your own brand, your own content business, you've gone into full-time employment and then come back full cycle. Was that shift back into running your own business, was that intentional? Was there a moment that triggered it?
I think I really appreciate the kind of freedom and flexibility that brought me, especially when I was younger, and it's something that I'm really enjoying now. I think also I really enjoy working with different clients. It's part of the reason why, THG was incredibly fast paced, but I enjoyed THG. I've enjoyed working agency side because you get to work with so many different clients. And that is something I really enjoy. I think the in-house role, it wasn't suiting me anymore. And to be honest, I felt like I had a lot more to offer, and I wanted to see what that could look like. I knew I had, a very particular skill set. It just seemed like a natural evolution. I did know Abdu probably in, kind of my mid-20s. I knew there was going to come a time when I'd start my own business again, and go freelance, and it did just feel right. I hate to say I woke up one morning and felt it, but that is pretty much how it happened.
It's an interesting one, but yeah, there's always a beauty in knowing what the sort of underlying principle or event that triggered something. And a lot of the times, some people would tell you honestly that their career just happened, and none of it was intentional, and they've flown through their career, but it just happened. Whilst there's others who had a 3 to 5 year plan, and it's funny because at some companies, my manager would tell me you need to have a 3 to 5 year plan. And then at other businesses, my manager would say, no, just take every day as it comes. And you might have a 3 to 5 year plan. You might achieve that in a year. So there's always room to be a bit spontaneous about your career, particularly in marketing. It changes quite a lot, and it gives us a nice little segue. I want to shift gears slightly. You've built your own career at the intersection of brand, content, and now AI-enabled marketing operations. I want to get into what you actually seeing inside the businesses that you're working with right now. There's real tension right now between brand building and content volume. AI makes it possible to produce more content than ever, but most of it is quite forgettable. How do you advise businesses to navigate that sort of volume of content, but also maintaining the quality of content?
So there are a couple of things. I always suggest that businesses test AI or integrate AI with very, very specific use cases. The problem, Abdu, is when businesses run off that, that they're given budget to test an AI tool, but they don't have a strategy behind it. And I think that's when you start to see very generic content that's being produced because there is no strategy, or they're using generic AI tools that are not trained to their brand guardrails, for example, or their brand tone of voice. So there are two things. One, it's being very selective about the technology partner you use for those AI tools and services. And two, it's about having a very, very clear strategy. So I spoke with a potential client last week, and her team, she's in the e-commerce team, she's an e-com director, and her team had started to test AI, but they'd seen no real value because they were just testing it in kind of random workflows. There was a different team in the business who had a clear strategy, and they said, right, we're going to use AI for this use case, and we're going to use it in X number of workflows. And they started to see real traction in terms of not just the content they were producing, but how efficient the team was. So rather than use AI for content production, which I do still think you need human oversight for, right, to make it sound authentic, to make it sound human, they'd started to use AI for manual tasks where actually it was freeing up the team's capacity to think more strategically. And I think that was where it was really powerful, because that's where brands are going to see the biggest win. They're not just using AI to produce more content, they're using it very intentionally. And therefore that the content they get out of it is actually quite good. But I will just circle back to brands have to be very careful with the technology partner that they use, because publicly available tools like, Claude or ChatGPT, that's generic AI. It's trained on what's available on the internet. And any brand could put in any brief at the same time as another brand in another part of the world and get the exact same content. And that's where you're going to struggle. It has to be contextual and based on brand guardrails and the brand tone of voice.
Agree. And there's always that black box problem where did the AI tool bring that information from that it's given you, and how valid is that information? But what would you say to, there's a lot of those tools that have come about that would say we will optimize your brand for SEO, AEO, and GEO. And what we will do is take a look at your keyword ranking positioning. We will then look at the keyword opportunities, and we'll look at the FAQs. We will rewrite all of those for you every 3 months, but then we will produce X number of blogs every single week for you. You will train the tool over a 2-3 month period. You'll have your content writers. review, advise, and give feedback, and we will learn and learn and learn. And then the machine learning will get so good to the point where it will sound like it's one of your own that wrote that article, but you can produce that at a much higher volume. What would you say to tools like that?
I would use with caution, essentially. I think as long as there is human oversight and human judgment in the approval process, then it can actually be really beneficial. But what you don't want to do is almost set up an autonomous workflow where there is no human intervention. So you have to have a human reviewing for, I guess, kind of brand guidelines, tone of voice, for optimization, because the search data that the AI model is trained on may not necessarily be up to date unless you are feeding that data yourself. And it also needs to be checked to see if it comes across in a human voice, right? So one thing that I see a lot with companies is I could tell you, Abdu, within probably about 10 seconds if a piece of content has been produced by AI. There is no human emotion. It's structured in a very, very similar way each time based on the format you choose. To me, it's blindingly obvious, but that's just because I'm in the industry. And I think it is a brand's responsibility and kind of those marketing commercial teams' responsibility to go in and optimize it for their particular audience. It can give you a good framework. It can't give you a finished piece of work, and nor should it ever give you a piece of content that you can immediately click publish and push it out to market. That's slightly dangerous territory. There's got to be human oversight.
So how do you use it? Do you use AI to help brainstorm and generate more ideas, and then do some of the more admin heavy workload, but you're still the brain behind the content? You're still originating and writing, creating that content yourself?
Yeah, so very occasionally I'll use it for frameworks or ideation. So one example is if I've just done an executive workshop, for example, we've got two really strong voices in the room who disagree about something. I might then use AI to essentially come up with almost like a solution that kind of brings both messaging strands together. I'll almost use it to kind of tie everyone back together and make sure that everybody's on the same page. But in terms of the actual kind of content output, that's all myself. The only thing I would use it for is ideation and frameworks. But any kind of content output from AI Abdu has to be optimized.
Another thing that's really big in the space where you work is executive thought leadership. And that must be a big part of your work, helping founders and leadership teams find and use their voice. I find there's still a lot of resistance to that. Why do you think that is?
There can be a lot of resistance, I think, because, kind of founders and executive teams, they like to have full control. That there's a reason why they are the head of the business, and they like to be in control. One thing I try and do, what people are more receptive to, Abdu, is frameworks. So I will say to a founder, right, I'm going to give you a messaging framework. These are loosely the themes. This is loosely the content that I want you to produce. It could be LinkedIn. It could be a speech, for example, at a tech conference. I've done a lot of speech writing. And it's my job to essentially give them the guardrails that they can then go away and produce the content. On the other hand, I will be completely honest, there are some founders who want everything written for them. They know I will use some of their voice and their natural language, but I will be the one producing all of the content. So you're either met with resistance and then you provide the framework, or actually someone says, run with this, you produce the content for me, and I'll cast my eyes over it at the end.
And what would you say the biggest danger is for brands that are misusing AI in this space?
The biggest danger is that you will sound like everybody else and your audience will lose trust. You will lose brand trust. And if you lose brand trust, Abdu, you're losing revenue. You're missing a lot of sales opportunities. So the way for a brand now to stand out is to make sure they're using their authentic voice. And it comes back to this, engage, educate, engage, immerse piece, right? That we spoke about when we were at THG. You want to educate your audience. You want them to be engaged with you. You want them to be immersed in you as a brand. And that's how you build trust. If you're using generic AI and pushing content out to various channels, your consumers are going to go elsewhere. They're going to go to your competitors, and you will miss out on sales.
I suppose there's probably two possible versions of reality of where AI is heading. So the first version is where AI democratizes great content and great marketing. And the second version is a world where AI commoditizes content and marketing completely. Which do you think is going to be our reality in the next few years?
I don't think it's going to commoditize content. I think we're going to see a step backwards. I think what's happening now is we're past the hype stage. Brands are thinking about AI more strategically, but I actually think there's going to be some hesitance because um, the broader consumer is becoming more aware of what AI content looks like. It could be video, it could be creative, or it could be written. People are more tuned in to what those outputs look like, and I think they're catching brands out when they've used AI. There have been some really notable creative campaigns where AI has been used and it's gone very wrong. The AI is hallucinated, right? I think Vogue was one of them. They gave Ariana Grande an extra finger. There have been multiple occasions. And I actually think we're going to go backwards slightly, and brands are going to become a little bit more reluctant, and they will think about it even more strategically, because I think they've realized just how wrong it can go. And for them, that's a PR disaster, and they're losing consumers at the same time. So I think we're going to see a drop off in AI usage before it then increases and brands are approaching it in a more thoughtful way.
It's interesting you say that, because as far as content is concerned, over the last 5 or so years, people have wanted authentic content. So have started moving away from content that's overly polished, and that doesn't really engage. You kind of want something that's rough around the edges, looks like it was taken with a telephone camera,
Yeah.
as opposed to a studio. Isn't perfect, and that just comes across quite natural. AI is in the process of trying to perfect itself, trying to get slicker and slicker. And do you think AI is going in the opposite direction of the customer's desires and wants?
I think it absolutely is, because brands were initially using AI, especially in, kind of creative teams, to produce campaigns without the production costs, to produce, e-com imagery without actually having to do a reshoot. And now, as you say, people are really valuing that authentic storytelling. Storytelling will always win, Abdu. You're seeing on LinkedIn, people are using their mobile phones. You're seeing influencers on Instagram. They're showing you the unpolished parts of their life. Authenticity is selling. And I actually think it's a contrast to where AI is headed right now. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens over the next few years.
And you're an experienced keynote speaker as well as a panel moderator. And that's quite a different skill set to your advisory work and the content creation work. It's very different mindsets. People absorb information very differently in those different settings. How's doing the two helped you understand how your target audience absorb information differently, but also how did you manage to bring the two together?
It's really interesting. So I think I had my first few opportunities when I was in tech, and I hosted a couple of customer days. I hosted a couple of conferences, and I actually really enjoyed it. It's incredibly nerve-wracking being on stage in front of hundreds of people, but it comes back to the storytelling piece, because people don't remember statistics. They remember the stories that you tell them, and they certainly don't remember slides, but they'll remember moments in your delivery and how you communicate that information. And it taught me a lot when I'm now speaking to, different teams within businesses and even potential clients, is how do I want this information to be received? I don't want to just give them a load of numbers, because anybody could do that. But if I can tell them a story about what I've been able to achieve using the levers that I then sell, it's so powerful. And I think it stood me in really good stead from a communication perspective in having those kind of, conversations with clients and potential clients.
And a lot of the time when you're speaking to panelists, they will probably bring a version of the reality that might not necessarily exist in front of an audience, and they'll talk about the perfect case study. After that session finishes, they'll probably go back to the office, be sweating and try to figure out how on earth to uncover the real solution here, and they're still struggling with the problem that on stage they had figured out and they've done an amazing job at. How did the two versions of reality impact your ability to go and land a new client?
That's really interesting. I think, honestly, this comes back to earlier in my career when I was blogging. I've really realized over the last couple of years the power of just being honest, the power of being honest, and the power of also being vulnerable. And I've used this a lot, Abdu, when I've been on stage, is you have a window of probably about 30 to 45 seconds to connect with the audience that you're in front of. Otherwise, they're going to tune out. And within that window, if you can be vulnerable about something you've experienced, how you're feeling in the present moment, or your attitude towards something, you've already hooked people in and they're already listening. And that's something that I've taken forward with me in, conversations with clients and prospective clients, because actually it's the storytelling piece and it's the vulnerability and the authenticity that make people want to trust you.
A lot of people feel that when on stage, I need to come across like I'm in total control. But nobody, not a single person in that room feels in total control. And so
Yeah.
if you are coming across in total control, you're probably alienating the audience the way you come across. If you are showing that vulnerability, there's a lot of power in that in terms of engaging people. But on the note of panel discussions and public speaking, what topics do you find yourself being asked to speak about right now that you think the industry genuinely hasn't figured out yet?
I think brand building, I get asked to speak a lot about brand building, AI integrations, and also the future of e-commerce in relation to AI. One thing that I think is really interesting about the brand building piece is I've seen this in businesses where brand as a whole is operating quite separately to marketing, for example. So you've got a team trying to build a brand, create an overarching narrative, decide how we're kind of going to market, how we're positioning ourselves versus competitors. And then you've got the marketing team running with messaging that actually completely contrasts that. And the brand building piece is key because brand is also a massive part of commercial impact and a business's kind of commercial goals, but they have to work in tandem with the marketing teams for the market positioning to be clear to potential buyers and to competitors and, things like analysts, for example. So that's something that I think is really interesting, the intersection of brand and content and how leveraging kind of those two channels together can either enable a business's success or actually hinder their success and cause ambiguity.
That's really interesting. And I think a lot of brands go into AI for the sake of being involved with AI. And within e-commerce, I think to double click into that, a lot of brands will go and get an AI chatbot, customer service agent, an AI personalization engine to give product recommendations, search and merge, AI tools to support their CRM. But the reality is each one of those tools has its own hallucinations, its own view of the customer interactions, and you run a risk of having conflicting recommendations from the different AI agents. And the part that brands don't necessarily see as really appealing or fun to talk to is building the workflows that control the thinking behind all of those various AI tools so that they are exchanging learnings and that you are very much in control. And I personally look at that and think that's one of the biggest risks, is having so many different AI tools running their own fields of specialism without having that central nervous system, so to speak, that tells them, if you see this, you go back to the drawing board here. And then when this happens, tool 1, 2, and 3, this is what you're going to do and feed in that information. And this is how we use that information. That part of it isn't fun. It's quite admin heavy, can come across as monotonous, but perhaps, in my opinion, the most important part of getting AI right, and at least protecting yourself from getting those sort of hallucinations. But moving on to the last maybe 3-4 questions for you. You've gone from blogger to brand leader to then founder, and you're still relatively early in the sort of True Meridian chapter. What's the thing you're most actively figuring out right now that you didn't anticipate when you started it?
I am learning to get comfortable with being visible. That sounds really crazy, but I think, throughout my career, I started in a very kind of visible role. I was blogging. I, kind of lived my life online. I made money from being online. But I haven't really had to think about that, Abdu, when I've been in full-time roles for the last, kind of 8 years. And now, as a founder, you have to put yourself in the right rooms. There's pitching, there's conversations to be had. There are introductions that people are making. I'm having to learn to get really comfortable with actually being a little bit uncomfortable. I actually haven't historically used LinkedIn in the way that a lot of people use it. I've had a lot of organic introductions, for example. My Instagram has been a really good channel for my business, but I need to be more active and I need to be more visible to basically be in the right spaces with the right potential clients. So that's something I'm working through at the moment.
Interesting. And do you feel you've underutilized LinkedIn? Is that something that you want to change, or are you happy with the way it is?
I think I do want to utilize LinkedIn a little bit more. I'll be really honest, my feed now is kind of full of AI posts. I don't know whether you've seen it, but there's a lot of people who are posting thought leadership and it's just AI generated and I can spot it a mile off. So I do think the nature of LinkedIn has changed slightly. It used to be kind of real, honest, personal stories, career journeys and even personal journeys. And I do think things are changing. People are using it slightly differently. But certainly from a, kind of connection and lead generation perspective, it is still very valuable.
And what's something about how technology companies approach brand and marketing that you think is fundamentally broken or flawed and isn't being spoken about honestly enough?
I think there are a lot of technology companies that don't see the value of marketing. So I see quite often sales and marketing working in silo. And actually what I see between the two teams is quite a lot of tension, because there are commercial targets tied to the sales team, for example. And while there are commercial or pipeline targets tied to marketing, it might not be as clear to track. And so I think a lot of companies prioritize the sales strategy, the sales output, are we getting in front of events and booking meetings, rather than actually the power of those two things working together and all the different marketing tactics that could help them achieve their pipeline targets quicker. So it's a really interesting kind of dichotomy. And I actually don't think there are many businesses that have fully figured that out yet. Part of my role is to kind of come in and help them understand how powerful that cross-functional collaboration can be. But there are a lot of businesses operating in silos. So I think actually it's that they don't understand the value of marketing.
And if we spoke again in 12 months, what do you think will be different for you, I guess, or for the industry?
I think we'll be having probably a different conversation about the use cases that technology companies are using AI for. I don't know what that looks like yet, because as I said, I think there's going to be a bit of hesitance over the next kind of 6 to 12 months in terms of brands implementing it without a clear strategy. But it'll be really interesting to see, as technology platforms develop, as e-commerce software develops, what is it that AI can actually solve for those internal teams, and how can it actually support within workflows? So I think it'll be more a case of how the technology evolves, and then how brands kind of approach that evolution and how they start working with AI later down the line.
And that takes us to the final question of the episode. The question that we end every episode with. Beth, what is still loading for you right now?
I think it's the visibility piece, Abdu. Still loading is, I think getting comfortable with being more visible.
What do you mean by that?
As in, whether that's at kind of like events or being on stage, I am essentially now, the face of the business. So it's kind of my responsibility to be as visible as possible in order to get myself in the right spaces.
What part of visibility are you not comfortable with?
I guess it's the sales aspect. Like I'm essentially now responsible for, kind of like selling my services. I'm essentially in a sales role, which I've never been in a sales role my entire career. So I think still loading is that, how do I balance, kind of knowing my expertise and what I'm able to deliver with selling that, rather than kind of organic leads come through, but actually selling that to new potential clients that might be on my target account list. I think that's still loading for me.
It's a real struggle, I think, to go from service provider to an expert to then a salesperson.
Yeah.
Wanting to close a new customer. That's always, I guess, the uncomfortable part of the conversation. But look, you got to where you got to doing that. So obviously you're doing something right. And the more you evolve, the more you do this, you'll just get better. So it's onwards and upwards from here. Beth, that's a perfect place to land. From a lifestyle blog in a student bedroom to advising technology founders on how to tell their story very clearly and still figuring it out. That's exactly the kind of journey this show exists to talk about. Thank you for being honest today, Beth. You could have given me the polished advisory answer, but you didn't. And that's what this show is for. Beth, where can people find you if they wanted to continue this conversation with you?
On LinkedIn. Beth Norton, and also on Instagram. My Instagram handle is Beth_Norton.
Amazing. And we'll link everything in the show notes. We'll be back next week with another conversation, another first click, another person figuring it out one step at a time. Still loading, just like the rest of us.